I've learned that the forest speaks long before it decides to show its face. Sometimes it murmurs like breath through pine needles, like other times it growls from a place your flashlight can't reach, but the message is always the same. You're not alone, and you never were. I didn't understand that in the beginning. Back then, I believed the woods were honest. I believed the land only threatened those who disrespected it. But I've spent enough years out here to know that the forest has its own memory, its own moods, and its own way of reminding you that your logic means nothing to it. And the first time I felt the truth of that, really felt it, was the night I realized something ancient had been watching me for far longer than I had been watching over these trees. My name isn't important, not really. But I'll give you something to call me. I'm 47 years old, a forest ranger assigned to the northern stretch of the Pine Barrens in Washington state, a place the locals speak about carefully, like they're choosing their words so the wrong ones don't wake something sleeping in the underbrush. I grew up a few towns over, raised by a father who hunted for meat and a mother who prayed for protection, both of them believing that the wild gave and took with equal hunger. When I was young, I thought their warnings were metaphors, the kind parents use to keep kids from wandering too far. But now I know that the warnings were literal. I know because I've lived them. My station isn't large, just a cabin built on a ridge with radio equipment, a few supply shelves, and maps pinned to the walls like fragile promises that humans can chart land older than language. The locals call this stretch the Whisper Range, named after the way wind moves through the pines in winter. But if you spend enough nights alone out here, you start to understand the tone of those whispers. Sometimes the wind doesn't sound like wind. Sometimes it sounds like conversation, sometimes like warning. Most visitors don't feel it. They pass through with their cameras, their backpacks, their belief that national forests are playgrounds built for their weekend adventures. But the ones who live here, the old loggers, the tribal families who've been here longer than the county itself, they know the stories. They don't share them easily. You have to earn them, usually by surviving something first. My first year out here, nothing strange happened. Not a thing. I patrolled trails, cleared deadfall, patched up hikers who didn't respect their ankles or the weather, and slept under the easy illusion that job experience alone made you competent. I thought I was immune to fear because I could identify tracks, move quietly, and keep a level head. But fear doesn't live in the things you can point to. Fear waits for the moments when you question what you saw, what you heard, what you dismissed. Fear thrives in doubt. The doubt began on a night when the temperature dipped without warning. A cold so sharp it bit through my jacket and made the air feel brittle. I was hiking toward an old fire road around dusk, checking on reports of illegal campsites. The sky had that strange metallic color that comes right before snow, even when the forecast insists the clouds should be empty. My breath fogged in front of me, and every step seemed louder than usual, like the forest floor had been wrapped in something hollow. It was around then that the knocking started. At first it was faint, somewhere behind me. 3 taps, slow, steady. I stopped, the way any ranger does when they think a branch is about to fall, but the forest stayed still. Then the knocking came again. 3 taps, same rhythm, closer this time. I turned and scanned the trees. Nothing. No movement. No animals bolting. No branches shaking, but the sound had been unmistakable. Knuckles on wood. Not claws. Not branches. Knuckles. A sensible mind creates sensible explanations. Woodpecker. Echo. Shift in the trees. But I'd grown up around woodpeckers. Their tapping is frantic, uneven, hungry. This was deliberate, unhurried, almost polite. I tightened my grip on my flashlight and moved forward, telling myself it was just the acoustics of the ridge. The forest absorbs sound in strange ways sometimes. That was the story I clung to, but I hadn't taken 10 steps before the knock came again. 3 taps, this time from the left of the trail, right where the light faded into shadow. I remember the exact shape my fear took in that moment. It wasn't terror. Not yet. It was a quiet unease, the kind that coils low in your gut and waits. I forced myself to check the tree line, shining the beam across trunks and ferns, knowing even as I looked that I wouldn't find anything. And I didn't. Just forest. Just dark. Just the feeling of something pulling back into the trees as the light swept over it. I radioed in anyway, gave a generic location update, pretending the act of speaking would make the world more ordinary. Dispatch responded with the usual, "Copy that, keep us posted." Their voice sounded too far away, as though the ridge was swallowing the signal, thinning the reassurance behind it. I pushed deeper into the woods, reminding myself that the job required confidence, not superstition. But the air felt heavier, the cold deepened. Even the pines seemed to press inward like they were listening. And then, beneath everything else, I caught a scent. Faint, wet, musky, like fur that hadn't dried from a storm long past. It drifted through the air in a way that didn't make sense. There was no breeze, no movement. I'd smelled bears, elk, cougars, but this was none of them. It carried something older, earthier, something that stirred a memory I couldn't place. I followed the trail another half-mile until I reached the old fire road. Snow flurries had begun falling, light, delicate flecks that disappeared before touching the ground. I told myself I'd do one quick sweep and return to station. Nothing about the night felt right. Just as I turned toward the first bend in the road, the knocking came again, 3 taps. But this time, it came from the trees directly behind me. I spun, light raised, breath locked in my throat. The forest stared back in silence. No shape, no movement. But the knocking wasn't random. It wasn't wandering around me. It was following me, like it wanted me to know that it was. That was the moment something inside me shifted. Not a full break, just a small fracture in my confidence. A subtle doubt. The first crack that fear needs in order to take root. And standing there on that silent road, I understood the truth my parents had tried to teach me years ago. The wild doesn't always bare its teeth. Sometimes it taps gently on the nearest tree, reminding you it knows where you are, and it's waiting. I should have turned back right then. Every instinct I had, every lesson carved into me from years in the field, told me that nothing good waits in a forest that suddenly goes quiet. But instinct is a strange thing. It doesn't always speak with the same authority as pride. And pride whispered that I was a ranger, a caretaker of these woods, and caretakers don't retreat because of a sound they can't explain. So instead of heading back the way I'd come, I steadied my breath, lowered my flashlight a little, and listened. When the forest decides to fall silent, it's never immediate. It's gradual, like a closing door. Frogs soften first, then the last bird calls fade, then the wind pulls back as if inhaling one long, quiet breath. What struck me about that moment wasn't the silence itself. It was how absolute it felt. Everything around me seemed poised on an invisible threshold, waiting for something I couldn't see. Even the snowflakes appeared to pause midair, drifting with a strange heaviness. I took a slow step backward on the fire road, trying to get a better angle of the trees behind me. My boot crunched on frozen needles, and for a heartbeat, I hoped the noise would snap the world back into normal. It didn't. The quiet only deepened. Then, just as I shifted my weight, something moved between the trees. I didn't see it clearly, not a body, not a face, but the shape of the darkness changed. A silhouette parted the trunks, tall enough that it blocked the faint ambient light filtering through the pines. It moved without sound. No footfall, no breath, no rustle, just a drifting shift of shadow. My throat tightened. I raised the flashlight and swept the beam across the trees. It should have revealed everything: branches, brush, the empty spaces between the trunks. Instead, the light caught something pale, something vertical. A tree? A piece of birch? No, it was gone before I could focus. I felt my heartbeat surge up into my jaw. I spoke into the silence without meaning to. Hello? My voice didn't sound like mine. It sounded thin, unsure, too small for the woods around me. No answer. The forest just watched. I took another step, not forward this time, but sideways, creating distance from the tree line. My hand dropped toward the flare case attached to my belt. Not that a flare would protect me from anything. But the thought of having fire, even a small burst of it, made me feel slightly less powerless. The knocking returned. 3 taps. But this time the sound didn't echo through the forest. It came from one single tree, one right behind me. Slow, deliberate, each knock thick and heavy like knuckles hitting old damp bark. I did not turn around immediately. Some part of me believed, irrationally, horribly, that the moment I turned, something would be staring back at me, something that had been waiting for me to face it. So I breathed. I forced air into my lungs and held it until my ribs ached. Then, inch by inch, I shifted, turning my head toward the tree behind me. Nothing stood there, just bark. Dark, ridged, cold. But the bark was wrong. 3 fresh depressions, circular, evenly spaced, marked the trunk at shoulder height, like someone had pressed their knuckles into the wood. My mouth went dry. That wasn't a woodpecker. That wasn't echo. Something had touched that tree. Recently. Intentionally. I swept the flashlight around again, turning in a slow circle. The forest remained still, but the feeling had changed. The air carried a new tension, something taut and waiting, as though the trees themselves were holding their breath. Then the scent returned, that wet, musky smell, fur soaked in old rain, drifted past me again, stronger now. Close. Too close. I knew without looking that whatever had made that scent was somewhere within 20, maybe 30 feet. I stepped back, then another step. The fear was no longer quiet. It fluttered up my spine like wings beating against bone. I pressed my radio. Dispatch, this is Ridge 4. My breath caught. I had no idea what to report. A knocking sound, a shadow, a smell. There's no protocol for something you can't describe without sounding unstable. I'm returning to station, I finally said. Trail conditions are not ideal. A pause. Static. Then, copy, Ridge 4. Let us know when you're inside. The voice was calm. Why wouldn't it be? They couldn't see what I saw. They couldn't feel it. I started moving, fast but controlled, keeping the flashlight low to catch movement near the ground. I wasn't looking behind me anymore. Instinct had shifted. Whatever fear had cracked earlier now spread fully through my body, filling my limbs, sharpening my senses. Every ranger knows the difference between normal fear, the kind that keeps you careful, and the other kind, the kind that tells you you're being hunted. I made it 10 yards down the fire road before I heard it. Footsteps, heavy, slow, matching mine. At first I thought it was echo, a trick of snow and silence. But when I stopped, the footsteps continued for 2 more beats before stopping too. Not echo then, not acoustic trickery. They hadn't matched my rhythm perfectly. They'd been slightly out of sync, as if something was reacting to me rather than mirroring me. My chest tightened to the point of pain. I forced myself to walk again, faster this time, not running, not yet. The footsteps followed, closer, crunching on frozen brush. I didn't turn. Couldn't. The only thing that kept me moving was the knowledge that turning wouldn't help. Whatever it was had already seen me. I kept following the fire road until the familiar outline of an old service gate appeared ahead. Rusted metal, bent slightly from years of snow load. Beyond it, the main trail waited, wider and safer. The footsteps stopped. Silence re-entered the world, sudden and complete. I slowed, then stopped entirely. The gate was 10 feet away. The forest behind me didn't move. The scent faded. The cold thickened. And in that moment, I had the bizarre thought that something was letting me go. Not losing interest. Not giving up. Just waiting. Waiting for me to return. The realization hit with enough force to make me sway. That thing, the shadow, the knuckles on the tree, the scent, it hadn't attacked. It hadn't rushed me. It hadn't even tried to hide the fact that it was there. It wanted me to know. It wanted to be remembered. By the time I reached the station cabin, my hands were shaking so badly I fumbled the keys twice before getting the door unlocked. Heat blasted from the vents when I stepped inside, but the chill clung to my jacket like it had burrowed into the fabric. I locked the deadbolt, something I hadn't done in months, maybe a year. I sat at the desk, radio still clipped to my shoulder, and listened for anything outside. Nothing. No footsteps. No knocking, just the hum of the heater and the faint rattle of wind against the windows. I told myself I'd hallucinated the sounds, that the cold had distorted my senses, that the dark played tricks on even the most seasoned ranger. But then, hours later, deep into the night, I woke to another sound. 3 taps on the cabin wall, deep, hollow, unmistakable, from the exact height of a man's knuckles. I froze in my bunk, heartbeat pounding in my ears. The knocking didn't come again. But I knew then that whatever followed me through the whisper range hadn't stayed behind on the fire road. It had found me, and it knew where I slept. I lay awake for a long time after that first knock on the cabin wall, staring at the ceiling, lungs frozen just below my ribs. You don't forget a sound like that, not when you're alone, not when there's only a few inches of wood between you and whatever walks beneath the pines. I waited for it to come again, to confirm the first wasn't some half-dream or twitch of the old logs contracting in the cold. But the room stayed silent. Only my pulse filled the darkness, pounding so hard it made the mattress vibrate. Eventually, I forced myself to sit up. The clock on the wall read 3:17 a.m. The cabin windows were fogged from the heat inside and the temperature outside, creating a strange barrier between me and the rest of the world. For a moment, I wasn't sure which side of the glass was more dangerous. I swung my legs off the bed and stood slowly, letting the blood return to my feet. My body felt heavy with dread, like something had settled onto my shoulders while I slept. I didn't turn on the lights. Training teaches you that light can blind more than guide, especially when you're trying to listen. I moved quietly across the cabin, each footstep deliberate. The boards creaked beneath me, and I flinched at the sound. I kept glancing at the window, expecting a face to appear, tall, broad, framed in frost. Nothing came. When I reached the wall where the knocking had sounded, I pressed my palm to the wood. It was still cold, not the natural cold of winter nights, the deeper one, the kind that seeps outward from something alive, the kind that feels deliberate. I kept my hand there until the heat of my skin overpowered the unnatural chill. Then I whispered to myself, barely audible, "You imagined it. It was a lie." But lies are sometimes the only tools you have left when reason starts slipping. The next morning, I returned to work as if nothing had happened. Rangers don't get the luxury of retreating into fear. Winter brings enough hazards that you can't waste time on ghosts, even the kind that pound on your walls. I logged the typical morning report, checked local trail closures, and set out for a routine perimeter sweep. I didn't mention the knocking, not to dispatch, not to the other rangers, not to the volunteers prepping firewood behind the station. Experience had taught me that sharing the wrong kind of uncertainty could stain your reputation, leak into your evaluations, put your career on thin ice. A ranger who jumps at shadows doesn't stay a ranger. But the forest noticed my silence. By noon, the wind had picked up, carrying the familiar scent of wet fur again, brief, fleeting, like a reminder placed gently at the back of my mind. I kept walking. The trees felt closer than usual. Not physically, mentally. They seemed to lean inward when I passed, angled just slightly in my direction. I reminded myself that snow load causes trunks to bow in unpredictable ways. Natural explanations are anchors. You cling to them even when they don't hold. I reached an overlook around midday. The clouds hung low, gray and swollen, and sunlight only broke through in weak, trembling beams. Down below, the valley looked untouched, quiet, white, peaceful. A hiker might have found the scene breathtaking. I found it unnerving. I sensed movement to my right, not the sharp motion of an animal darting, something slower, deliberate. I tightened my scarf and walked toward the sound. A young woman was standing near the tree line, bundled in a blue jacket, her face pale beneath her wool hat. She wasn't on a marked trail. She wasn't even close to one. I called out gently, not wanting to startle her. "Ma'am, you all right?" She didn't answer at first. Her gaze was fixed on a single point deep within the trees, unblinking. When I got closer, she finally spoke. Her voice was thin, drained. "Did you hear it?" That sentence hit me harder than any knock on the cabin wall. I kept my tone calm. "Hear what?" She swallowed hard, hugging her arms to her chest. "The tapping. A cold wave rolled through me. I scanned the forest behind her. How many taps? 3, she whispered. Always 3. My breath stilled. I convinced myself that the smart thing, the responsible thing, was to treat this like a routine welfare check. Maybe she'd been out too long. Maybe she was dehydrated. Maybe she'd heard a downed branch somewhere behind her and translated the sound into something else. It happens more often than people assume. Let's walk you back to the main trail, I said softly. Can you tell me your name? She blinked as if the question took a long time to reach her. Lena. Okay, Lena. I'm going to get you somewhere warmer. Does that sound all right? She nodded slowly, but when she took her first step, she stopped abruptly and looked over her shoulder. You shouldn't follow it, she murmured. Follow what? She raised her glove and pointed toward the densest patch of pines, the tall one. The words hit me like a bruising blow. The tall one. It was a name, not of a person, but of something else. Something she believed enough to fear. I didn't turn to look. Looking would mean acknowledging the possibility of truth. I gently guided her back to the trail. She kept glancing behind us, shoulders tight. Every time her boots crunched on the snow, she flinched like she expected another sound to answer hers. When we reached the main walking path, a couple appeared from the opposite direction. Their presence made Lena breathe easier. I radioed in for med check assistance, and when the volunteers arrived to escort her back toward town, she turned to me one last time. Her eyes were wide, fearful, with a sheen of something deeper, recognition. It knows you now, she whispered. My stomach twisted. What do you mean? She shook her head, stepping backward with the volunteers. I saw its tracks, and I saw your name. I frowned. Where? But she didn't answer. She just looked at me with a sorrow that didn't belong on someone her age, then let the volunteers lead her away. I stood there long after they disappeared around the bend, the words gnawing at the back of my skull. I saw its tracks, and I saw your name. There was no rational explanation for that, none that didn't crack something inside me. I resumed my patrol, but every sound felt amplified, warped. The forest no longer looked passive. It looked alert, watching. When I passed the old creek bed, something new caught my eye. Prints in the snow. Large prints. Too large. Each print sank deeper than my own weight ever could have. The stride length was wrong too. Impossibly long. The snow around them was disturbed in a way that suggested whatever made them moved with a towering, heavy gait. A chill knotted through my spine. But the worst part wasn't the size or the depth. It was the pattern. 3 steps. Pause. 3 steps, pause, matching the rhythm of the knocks. My body wanted to run, but the ranger in me forced a slow, controlled breath. I crouched near the nearest track and pressed 2 fingers to the snow beside it. The snow was still partially melted from the heat of contact. Whatever made those prints had been there minutes earlier. Behind me, a breeze drifted through the pines, carrying that old, damp scent again. Stronger now, almost suffocating. I didn't turn around. Couldn't. Because this time I knew the truth. The knocking hadn't been a random sign, a warning, or a threat. It had been calling me, drawing me, and something in the forest wanted me to follow. Partial 1,230 words. I stood there longer than I should have, staring at those prints as if they might rearrange themselves into something logical if I willed it hard enough. Snowflakes drifted lazily through the air, landing inside the impressions but melting instantly, as though the heat lingering in the tracks resisted the cold around them. Something massive had been there, so massive the snow hadn't yet reclaimed its shape. I straightened slowly, every part of me alert, nerves trembling beneath my skin. The forest around me looked the same as it had every other winter day, but it didn't feel the same. The air had weight now. Intention, like the silence itself had grown predatory. I forced myself to walk away from the tracks. Each step felt like I was straying deeper into a place I didn't belong, even though I was still on familiar ground. I kept telling myself not to look over my shoulder. The urge was nearly unbearable. When you feel watched, your body tries to twist toward the sensation, desperate to confirm it, but instinct held me back. I knew with a certainty that bordered on primal fear that if I turned around now, if I allowed myself even one glance, I would see something standing between the trees. I didn't want to know what shape waited for that moment. By the time I reached the base of the ridge, the smell faded. The trees loosened. The sounds of the world returned. The soft moan of wind, a distant creak of ice shifting on a branch, the faint tap of a woodpecker far away, normal sounds, human sounds. But I didn't trust them the way I once did. I made it back to the station by late afternoon. My hands were stiff, my shoulders ached, my mind felt scraped raw. I kept reminding myself to breathe evenly, act normal, keep my face calm. Rangers don't get shaken. Rangers don't panic. But that was becoming harder to believe. When I stepped inside the cabin, the warmth hit me with a strange, suffocating intensity. I locked the door without thinking. Then I double-locked it. I dropped my pack near the table, shrugged off my jacket, and sat down heavily. That's when I realized something was wrong. Not in the room, on the table. Someone had placed my field notebook exactly in the center of the wooden surface, perfectly aligned with the grain, squared as if measured. That notebook usually lived inside my pack. I hadn't opened it since the previous week, and no one else had a key to the cabin. I didn't move at first. My eyes stayed fixed on the notebook, waiting for the world to offer me an explanation. After a long moment, I reached out and opened it. My field notes stared back at me. Dates, weather observations, incidents, the usual routine. But the last page had changed. Someone had written on it. 3 words, scratched into the paper hard enough to tear the sheet. I see you. The pen strokes were thick, heavy, uneven, written with a strength I didn't want to imagine. My stomach twisted so violently I thought I might be sick. I slammed the notebook shut and shoved it away from me. But the words burned behind my eyelids, refusing to fade. I see you. The cabin suddenly felt too small, too quiet. I stood, pacing the floor with a kind of restless panic I couldn't hide anymore. My breath turned shallow. My fingers tingled. Every instinct in me screamed to get out, but where would I go? Outside, something waited in the trees. Inside, something had touched my belongings. I didn't feel safe anywhere. That night, I slept horribly, if you can call what I did sleeping. I drifted in and out, always waking with the feeling that someone had just stepped back from my bed. At one point, I thought I heard a faint scraping sound near the door. Not knocking this time, dragging, slow, careful, as though claws or fingers were testing the wood grain. But when I forced myself to look, the room was empty. By dawn, exhaustion settled into my bones, but work waited, regardless of fear. I spent the morning checking radio frequencies, updating trail status, and forcing myself to act normal during a brief call with a ranger from the Southern District. He joked about the cold snap. I pretended to laugh. It was around midday that I received a report that changed everything. A local man, one of the old-timers who lived 2 valleys over, had gone missing. His wife had filed a concern call saying he'd gone out before sunrise to check his trapping lines. He hadn't returned. The dispatcher's voice came through steady and factual, but I could hear the undertone. Another one. Another disappearance in an area with too many of them already. I geared up immediately. Fear or not, the job demanded action, and maybe part of me welcomed the distraction, something tangible, something rooted in reality. The man's trapping area was deep into one of the oldest sections of the forest, where the pines grew taller and the valley floor stayed dark even at noon. Locals avoided the place except when they had no other choice. They called it the Old Sleepers, named for the ancient trees that seemed to lean together as though sharing dreams. I hiked out fast, letting the rhythm of movement push away the fear clawing at my ribs. But when I reached the edge of the Old Sleepers, the unease returned. The forest was wrong again. The air heavier. The scent stronger. The silence absolute. I found the man's first trap easily, undisturbed. His tracks were clear in the snow, normal stride, normal weight distribution. He had moved deeper into the trees without hesitation. I followed. Half a mile in, the forest seemed to close around me. The trunks grew denser, the light dimmer, Every sound I made seemed swallowed instantly by the air. Then I found the second trap. It was smashed, not sprung, smashed. The heavy steel frame was bent inward as if something had gripped it and crushed it like a tin can. The snow around it was disturbed. There were prints, but not the man's. Not human. Not any animal I recognized. Large. Deep. Spaced unnaturally far apart. My heart began to hammer. I called out the missing man's name, my voice echoing strangely through the trees. No response. I kept moving. 20 yards later, I found something else. A scrap of fabric caught on a broken branch. A piece of the man's jacket, navy blue, frayed at the edge, stained with something dark. The tracks around the branch told a story I didn't want to read. His steps had gone from steady to frantic. The snow showed it clearly. He had started running. Hard. Fast. Then his tracks ended. Just stopped. As if something had lifted him off the ground entirely. But the other tracks continued. 3 steps. Pause. 3 steps. Pause. I felt my pulse in my throat now, pounding so violently it blurred my vision. I looked around, desperate for any sign of the man. Broken branches, disturbed snow, anything. Nothing. Only silence. Only the endless rows of pines, tall and still, as though holding their breath. It was then I noticed something carved into a nearby trunk. Letters. Deep. Jagged. My name. Carved at a height no human arm could reach without a ladder. I staggered back, stumbling into the snow. The world tilted. My breath seized. The cold pressed into my skull like a vice. It didn't carve the missing man's name. It carved mine. A message. A claim. The forest around me seemed to shift, closing in. A shadow moved somewhere behind the trees, slow, massive, deliberate, not approaching, not hiding, waiting. The same way it had waited on the fire road, the same way it had waited outside my cabin. A pressure built in my chest, a sensation so strong it almost forced me to my knees. Panic finally surged through me, unstoppable. I turned and ran. Branches whipped against my jacket, snow sprayed around my boots, my breath tore in and out in broken bursts. Behind me, I heard something move. Heavy, slow, a rhythm I recognized too well. 3 steps, pause. 3 steps, pause, matching mine. I didn't stop, not until the trees thinned, not until the air shifted, not until the weight of the forest lifted just enough for me to breathe again. Only then did I realize I wasn't running from a creature. I was running from something older, something that knew my name, something that had been watching me for years. By the time the forest finally loosened its grip on me, my lungs were burning and every muscle in my legs trembled with exhaustion. I bent forward, bracing my hands on my knees, gulping cold air like someone drowning just beneath the breaking point. I kept expecting to hear footsteps behind me, those heavy, deliberate steps matching my rhythm from just moments before, but the woods had fallen silent again. Not peaceful, not safe, just silent, in the way a held breath is silent. I knew, even without turning around, that whatever had followed me had stopped the moment I crossed that invisible border out of the old sleepers. It wasn't fear that kept it within the ancient grove. It wasn't confinement. It was choice. It had let me go. Or worse, it had let me run. I didn't head back to the station immediately. I didn't trust myself to walk inside that cabin while my pulse still hammered from panic. Instead, I followed the trail until I reached a clearing near a frozen pond. The sky was shifting toward dusk, the light thinning into a faint blue wash that made the world look fragile. I collapsed onto a fallen log and stared across the surface of the ice. For the first time since becoming a ranger, I felt small in a way I couldn't repair with equipment, training, or logic. The forest wasn't just older than me. It was older than my understanding. Older than the rules I'd dedicated my life to. And something within it, something tall, something watching, had decided that I was worth noticing. I sat there for what felt like an hour, trying to steady my breathing, trying to stitch myself back into a person who could function. When I finally rose again, I did it slowly, as if any sudden movement might draw attention from something I couldn't see. The walk back to the station was long, cold, and marked by a growing sense that the world was shifting around me. The trees seemed taller, their shadows stretching in unnatural configurations. Every gust of wind whispered faint sounds I couldn't translate. Every pause in the woods felt purposeful. By the time I reached the ridge near the cabin, dusk had taken the forest entirely. Only the faint orange glow of the station lights broke through the dark. My feet crunched over the frost-covered ground, and I forced myself to imagine the warmth inside, the normalcy, the walls, the illusion of safety. I stepped inside, locked the door, and exhaled shakily. The cabin was quiet. My notebook was still where I'd left it, closed, untouched. Part of me wanted to throw it into the stove, burn the words carved into the page so their presence couldn't haunt me anymore. But I couldn't bring myself to destroy it. Not yet. Evidence feels like sanity when the world starts to slip. Night came quickly. I ate without tasting the food. I checked the locks too many times. I sat at the desk with a radio in hand, listening for updates on the missing man, but no new information came through. Around 11, I finally lay down, hoping exhaustion would override fear. It didn't. I drifted in and out of shallow sleep, each dream darker than the last. In one, I walked through the old sleepers, following the three-step rhythm. In another, I saw my name carved into tree trunks that stretched infinitely upward. But the last dream, the one that snapped me awake, was the worst. I was standing in front of my cabin. Snowfall glowed dimly in the porch light, and there at the edge of the forest stood a shape, tall, massive, its outline blurred by shadow. It leaned its head to the side, curious, almost gentle. Then it lifted its arm and knocked 3 times. I woke gasping, heart slamming against my ribs. It took me several seconds to realize the knocking hadn't been in the dream. It was real, on the cabin wall. 3 deep taps, each one vibrating through the wooden frame. I froze, completely. The knocking came again. 3 taps, closer now, lower on the wall as if something were crouched. My breath fogged in the cold air of the cabin. I stood slowly, every joint stiff with dread, and stepped toward the window. My hand shook as I gripped the edge of the curtain. I hesitated, torn between 2 equally unbearable possibilities, seeing something or not seeing anything at all. Finally, I pulled the curtain back. The porch was empty. The tree line was still, the snow undisturbed, but the air outside the window shimmered faintly, like heat rising off asphalt. The temperature in the cabin dropped noticeably. My breath formed clouds with every exhale. Then, drifting on that thin shimmer, I caught the faintest outline of something tall, something stepping backward into the woods, not running, not hiding, retreating, leaving me with the message it wanted to give. The same message carved into my notebook: I see you. I stayed awake until morning, sitting at the table with my radio and my flashlight, listening to the cabin move in the wind. I didn't open the door. I didn't step outside. I repeated the same 4 words in my head until they lost meaning. You're still alive. You're still alive. But morning brought no relief. Dispatch called with an update on the missing man. They had found his body. The tone of the report told me everything before the words did. No animal attack leaves wounds like those. No fall produces marks that deep. No bear, no wolf, no cougar drags a grown man 30 feet through the snow without leaving a single set of prints that match its species. The only tracks found near his body were large and spaced in sets of 3. I didn't speak for a long time after hanging up. I just sat there, staring at the floor, my mind numb. Something in me shifted in that moment, not panic, not disbelief, but acceptance. The forest wasn't what I thought it was. It wasn't what any of us thought it was. The stories locals whispered weren't superstition or folklore or cautionary tales for tourists. They were warnings. And I had ignored them. I attended the recovery effort. I stood with the other rangers. I gave my statements. I answered their questions. I kept my voice steady. I kept my expression controlled. But the entire time, I felt eyes on me from the tree line. Not hostile, not even triumphant, just present, watching, claiming. That night, I made a decision I didn't think I would ever have to consider. I sat at my desk, pulled out the notebook, the same one marked with the message, and opened a new page. I started writing every detail I could remember. Every knock, every scent, every shadow, every word the woman had spoken in the woods. I wrote until my hand cramped and my vision blurred. I wrote until sunrise. Not because I thought it would protect me, but because truth matters, even when it terrifies us. Especially then. When I finished, I closed the notebook gently and set it in the center of the table, same place the creature had placed it days before. I stepped outside into the cold morning air, letting the silence of the forest settle around me. The pines towered above, their branches whispering like distant voices. The world felt vast and ancient again, larger than fear, larger than understanding. And I understood something. The forest spirits weren't stories, they were reminders that the land remembers everything, every footstep, every mistake, every intrusion, reminders that we walk upon something older than we can comprehend, reminders that watchers exist in places we pretend are empty. I took one last breath and whispered words meant only for the woods. I see you too. The wind stirred, brushing past me like a slow exhale. Somewhere deep in the pines, far beyond what my eyes could reach, something shifted, slow, deliberate, acknowledging. A presence that had followed me, tested me, marked me. A presence that would never fully leave. And yet, for the first time, I didn't flinch. Fear hadn't left me. But something else had taken root alongside it, a strange, quiet understanding. The forest had its spirits, its guardians, its warnings. And I had become part of those stories now, woven into the whispers locals would one day tell by firelight. A ranger who learned too late that reason is fragile. A ranger who saw something tall in the pines. A ranger who survived long enough to know the truth. Some watchers knock to frighten you. Others knock to teach you. And some knock simply because they know you're listening. The first thing you should know is that the forest doesn't welcome everyone the same way. Some people walk among the pines and hear nothing but wind and bird song. Others, people like me, hear the spaces between the trees breathing. And on some nights, when the temperature drops fast and the needles freeze into little glass knives, you can feel the pines leaning closer, as if they want to tell you something you're not ready to hear. My name doesn't matter as much as the years I've spent out here. 23 seasons as a forest ranger, most of them alone, patrolling the northern stretch of the Cascade Range where the ground rises in jagged folds and the fog settles like a protective layer over everything buried beneath. I'm 47 now, old enough to have lost people, old enough to know when silence is hiding something. The locals tell stories, old folklore, strange sightings, voices carried across miles of timber, but they say it with a shrug, almost apologizing for their own superstitions. They shouldn't. Not out here. Not in these woods. I've worked the same district long enough for the line between forest and memory to blur. The town that feeds into this stretch of wilderness is small, barely a couple hundred people. A place where everyone knows who's fighting with who's had too much to drink, and whose granddad claimed he saw something tall and pale watching him between the trees. Outsiders call the locals dramatic. I call them wise. The mountains keep their own counsel, but sometimes they slip, and when they slip, someone always goes missing. The first year I worked this area, I tried to rationalize everything. The shadows were just shadows. The sounds at night, knocking, snapping, a low groan that vibrated through the tent canvas were just animals. The pines creaking in the wind, temperature shifting, roots expanding or contracting in the soil. That's what they teach you in ranger school. That's how you survive your early years. You build a wall of explanations sturdy enough to keep out the unknown, but the unknown always finds the cracks. My station sits near a long sweep of old-growth forest, trees so tall you have to bend back until your neck protests just to see the canopy. When the fog rolls in, it comes low and thick, crowding the ground until you feel like you're walking through someone else's breath. I didn't used to mind it. I do now. The first incident that shook me happened in my 8th year. Not enough to break me, but enough to make me doubt my own instincts for a long while. I was checking a trail around dusk, the kind of late summer evening when the air grows heavy and the crickets get loud enough to feel like they're pulsing through your ribs. I reached a clearing where the ground dipped into a bowl shape. The sunlight caught the dust drifting in the air, making it glow. At first, everything looked normal. Scattered pine cones, deer tracks, the fading prints of a hiking group that had passed 3 days earlier. Nothing unusual. Then I smelled it. Not rot, not a dead animal, not sulfur or smoke. It was sweet. Sickeningly sweet. Like overripe fruit left too long in the sun. It drifted in slow, lazy waves and carried by a wind that didn't blow through the trees above me, just around my legs. A ground wind. Wrong. Unnatural. And under the sweetness was something metallic. Sharp. The smell of blood, but distant, as if it had soaked deep into the soil and was trying to rise back up. I remember standing still, completely still, every instinct in my body telling me to leave the clearing. But I'd been a ranger almost a decade at that point, and duty has a way of grinding courage into you, whether you want it or not. So I forced myself forward, stepping into the bowl. That's when the sound began. A click. Soft at first. Then another. 2 seconds apart. Click. Click. Not wood. Not a branch snapping. It was too deliberate, too rhythmic. It reminded me of teeth tapping together. I circled the clearing slowly, scanning for movement, listening for something bigger behind the small sounds. But the forest stayed still. Even the crickets stopped. That's when you know something is wrong. When the animals give up their own survival instincts and choose silence over warning. I crouched near a rotting log and found something in the mud, something I still think about on nights when sleep refuses to come. It was a footprint, human-shaped, narrow but too long. Too deep. The toes looked almost clawed, like whoever made it had dug into the earth as they ran or were dragged. The click came again. Closer now. I rose slowly, not wanting to disturb whatever was watching me, and I knew I was being watched. There's a tension the woods carry when something living, not just observing but assessing, is nearby. The hairs on the back of my neck lifted. My heartbeat synced to the clicking, each one tighter than the last. I backed out of the clearing, keeping my eyes fixed on the tree line. Something was there. Something pale flickered between the pines, too fast to track. I caught only a glimpse, long limbs, a slouching posture, movement that didn't match the gait of any animal I knew. And I know them all. I'd seen enough. I left. But as I walked, the clicking followed. Soft at first, then growing louder whenever I quickened my pace. Not echoing. Mimicking, keeping rhythm with my footsteps. When I reached higher ground, where the trees opened just enough to see the sky, the clicking stopped. All at once. As if whatever had been making it had dropped into the earth, sealing the sound behind it. I didn't tell anyone that night. Who would I tell? The older rangers would have chalked it up to fatigue. The locals would have told me their version. The pale walkers, the long shadows, the forest spirits who test the resolve of anyone who dares linger too long in their territory. But it wasn't a spirit, not the way they meant. Spirits don't leave footprints. For months after, I convinced myself it was a strange animal, some mangy bear or malnourished elk, maybe even a person who needed help. That's what denial does. It softens the edges of your fear, lets you sleep, lets you function. Until the second incident. The one that didn't just shake me. It reshaped me. That one started with a scream. It was late fall, cold enough that the ground stiffened each night. I was patrolling the ridge above the lake, checking old campsites, making sure no one had left a fire smoldering under the leaves. The sun was gone, leaving only the last streaks of dusk. And then I heard it, high-pitched, sharp, but cut off halfway. Not an animal. Not human distress the way you normally hear it. There was something else layered beneath it, a vibration that made my teeth ache. I froze. The sound echoed once across the lake, then disappeared. I tried to radio in, but the signal sputtered, normal for this area. The ridge blocks everything. So I moved quickly, heading toward the source of the scream. The air grew colder with every step, not gradually, like I'd crossed into a pocket of winter, and then the smell came back. That same sweetness, familiar now, crawling up from the soil like steam. I remember thinking, not again, not this. But fear has a way of sharpening duty, and duty has a way of demanding sacrifices you don't get to negotiate. I pushed forward, and that's where I found the second clearing, and the tracks, and the thing that still wakes me up at night. The second clearing was smaller, tighter, as if the trees themselves had leaned in over the years and pressed the earth inward. Moss grew thick along the edges, bright in the beam of my flashlight, but the center was stripped bare down to black dirt, a raw circle carved into the forest floor. Something had disturbed the soil recently. You can tell by the looseness, the way it shifts like breath under your boots. The smell was stronger here, not merely sweet but layered, fermented berries, wet fur, and underneath it all a coppery tang that made the back of my tongue prickle. I swept the beam slowly across the clearing, and that's when I saw them. More footprints, dozens, overlapping, some small, some long, some so deep they had pooled with icy water. They circled the clearing in strange, chaotic loops, as if whatever had been here moved without direction, or worse, without intention, like panic made physical. One set of prints caught my eye. They were spaced far apart, too far for a person, even running. The toe indents dug hard into the soil. Something had leapt, pushing off with a force that didn't match the stride of a human or a deer. I followed them with the light, tracing the arcs they made until they vanished into a patch of ferns trembling slightly, though there was no breeze. And then I saw it, a tuft of hair caught in the bristles of a bush, long, coarse, pale. I moved closer, leaning in until the beam hit it directly. It wasn't fur, not exactly. It was too straight for that, almost like human hair, but thicker, as if it belonged to something that grew under harsher conditions than our bodies ever evolved for. When I touched it, it stuck to my glove with a faint static cling. My pulse hammered at the base of my skull. I could feel it thumping against my hat. I remember thinking, don't jump to conclusions. Don't go there. Fear wants you to fill in the blanks with monsters, but denial has limits, especially when something leaves evidence behind. I looked up again, scanning the tree line. That's when I heard it. The knock. 3 taps. Pause. 3 more. Soft but deliberate, coming from deeper in the woods, somewhere behind the ridge where the darkness was thickest. A pattern. Just like before, but slower, spaced out like it was waiting for me to react between each set. My breath came out in a white plume. I didn't remember it being cold enough to see it. But there it was, fogging the air like I was breathing winter. I tried to calm myself, grounding my feet, forcing my voice steady as I called out, "Hello? This is the Forest Service. If anyone needs help, call back." I waited. Tap, 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 not closer, not farther, exactly the same distance, as if whatever was knocking wasn't moving, as if it was the woods themselves knocking. I clicked my radio again, static, a long burst of it, sharp enough that I flinched, then silence, the kind that doesn't feel empty, just held like a lung full of air waiting to exhale. The scream came again, not the same one. This was lower, broken, wavering mid-pitch, as if the vocal cords making it didn't fully understand how to shape human fear. It echoed off the ridge, bounced across the clearing, and landed right behind me, though I knew it hadn't come from there. My body responded before my brain could intervene. I spun around, flashlight raised, muscles tight, heart sprinting. The clearing was empty. Nothing but the circle of black dirt and the trembling ferns. But the knock. It started again. Faster now. Tap, 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 tap. I needed to move, but something in me, a stubbornness I now realized was closer to desperation, forced me to step toward the ferns. If someone was hurt, hiding, bleeding, it was my job to get them out. Rangers aren't trained to run from danger. We're trained to approach it carefully, methodically, even if every instinct screams otherwise. I pushed aside the fronds. Behind them was another print. Singular. Deeper than the rest. A heel mark pressed so far down I couldn't see the bottom. Around the edges, the soil seemed to cave in toward it, like the earth had sagged under a heavy weight. The edges were moist, almost glistening. Heat radiated from it. I reached a glove toward the indentation, but before I could touch it, everything went silent. The knocking, the faint wind, even my own heartbeat felt muted, as if my blood had stalled mid-pulse. Then, out of the darkness, something answered. Not a knock, not a scream, a breath, slow, wet, trembling, exhaled so close to my left ear the warmth grazed my neck. I froze. My flashlight beam quivered. I couldn't turn my head, couldn't lift my arm. My body locked up like prey. I waited for the next breath, but none came. Instead, a whisper drifted through the clearing. Not a word, not a language, just a rasp. A dragging inhale that carried the rhythm of speech without any meaning I could understand. The hair on my arms rose beneath the jacket. I forced myself to pivot slowly, inch by inch, sweeping the beam toward the sound. It carved arcs of light across the trees, catching nothing but bark and moss and shadows that felt wrong, too dense, too stacked, as if something taller than me had moved just a second earlier. Another breath, this time from the right. Then, movement, a flash of pale shape slipping between the trunks. Not human, not animal, too long in the limbs, too smooth in the way it pivoted back like joints bending where no joints should be. It was watching me. I felt it. That prickling behind the eyes, that sense of being measured like prey. I stepped back once, twice. Then the scream happened again, but this time it was mine. Not out loud, not with my mouth. It burst through my skull like an instinctive animal warning. Get out. Now, that's when the forest exploded with sound. Every tree groaned, the branches shook. Birds erupted from the canopy in a sudden, violent rush. The ground trembled gently under my boots, the way it does when something massive is moving close by. The knocks returned too, loud, frantic, overlapping. A chorus of tapping coming from every direction. I turned and ran. Branches whipped my arms and shoulders. The cold bit into my lungs. I didn't look back. Not because I was brave, but because some ancient part of me knew that if I saw what followed, I wouldn't recover. Not mentally. Not ever. When I reached the ridge, the knocking stopped again, just like before, as if crossing that invisible line cut the sound off. My breath shook in and out, fogging the air so thick I felt like I was choking on it. I radioed in again. This time it crackled to life. I forced myself to speak calmly as I requested backup, though my voice wavered enough for dispatch to ask twice if I was injured. By the time other rangers arrived, the clearing was empty. The footprints were still there, but the deep one, the impossibly deep one, had smoothed over like loose dirt filling itself in. The tuft of hair was gone, and though the others said they caught a faint sweet smell, it wasn't nearly as strong as what I'd breathed in. They chalked it up to a distressed animal, maybe a mountain lion, maybe an illegal trapper, maybe exhaustion playing tricks on my senses. I didn't argue, because arguing would mean admitting that I believed what I'd felt breathing behind me. That was the night I stopped trusting reason blindly. That was the night I realized some parts of the forest remember us just as we remember them, and some of them don't want us here. For the next few weeks after that night, I operated on autopilot, doing my rounds, filing reports, checking camps, talking to hikers, but internally I was split down the middle. The rational part of me kept repeating the same tired explanations: stress, low visibility, misidentified animal signs. But the deeper part, the older part, the part that had spent a lifetime listening to the forest, knew something had changed. Not out there. In me. The forest had pressed its fingers into me, testing the soft spots, and it had found them. Once something like that learns what you're afraid of, it doesn't forget. The locals noticed before I did. Folks at the diner, especially the older ones with weathered faces and eyes that seemed carved from the same timber as their cabins, would glance at me a little too long. One woman, Marlene, who'd lived in the area since before the dam was built, handed me my coffee one morning and said, "You've got the look, Ranger." "What look?" I asked. She didn't answer right away. She just leaned closer, voice dropping to a whisper meant for people in the entire room. "The woods saw you." I don't know how she said it with such certainty, but it felt less like a warning and more like a diagnosis. Something factual. Something already done. When I didn't respond, she set the mug down and walked away, as if she'd handed me a truth I wasn't ready to hold. The third incident didn't start with a scream or a knock. It started with a scent. I was checking a back route near the foothills, an area hikers rarely visited but poachers sometimes did. The snow had melted early that year, leaving the ground soft and dark and rich with the smell of pine sap. It was supposed to be an easy day. Simple trail maintenance, maybe picking up old trash squirrels dragged out of campsites. But halfway up the ridge, the wind shifted, and I caught a smell I recognized immediately. Sweet. Heavy, like rotting fruit mixed with damp earth and something metallic that stung the back of my throat, the smell from that first clearing. It hit me so suddenly that my knees almost buckled. The memory of that click, click, click pulsed through my skull, and for a second it felt like it was coming from inside my head instead of somewhere behind me. I stopped where I was, listened. Nothing. No birds, no wind, no rustling from deer or coyotes. Just that thick, suffocating sweetness. The trail ahead curved slightly to the left, obscured by a thick curtain of fir branches weighed down with dew. But just before the bend, I saw it. Something lying across the path. Something pale. At first I thought it was a fallen branch stripped of bark. But as I moved closer, my stomach sank. It wasn't a branch. It was a hand. A human hand. Detached. Fingers curled inward like it had tried to grip something in its last moment. I stepped back instinctively, one hand reaching toward my radio, but I didn't call it in yet. Not until I understood what I was looking at. The hand wasn't torn off. It wasn't chewed. The edges were clean. Too clean. As if cut with a blade that had no regard for bone or muscle, just severed perfectly, impossibly. My breath shook when I crouched down. The hand was fresh, no frostbite, no animal bite marks, no decay. Whoever it came from hadn't been dead long. I swept my flashlight around, even though daylight still filtered through the trees. The beam caught something else just beyond the hand. A piece of fabric, torn, olive green, ranger uniform. My stomach dropped so hard it felt like falling internal. The missing ranger. We'd been searching for him for 2 days. He'd radioed in once with a garbled message we couldn't make out. Then, nothing. Search teams found his truck at a service road, but no tracks. No signs of struggle, no clues. Until now. I forced myself forward, pushing the branches aside to follow the trail of torn fabric. 20 feet away, I found the second piece. This one stained dark red. Another 10 feet, I found his flashlight crushed into the mud. Then his radio snapped in half like someone had folded it. My breath began to quicken. The sweetness grew heavier, thickening the air, and then I heard the sound, a low, distant thud, not a knock, a footstep, a heavy one. Then another, far off, but too deliberate to be animal movement, too slow, too evenly spaced. Something big was walking somewhere ahead. I moved carefully, scanning every direction, trying to calm my heartbeat enough to hear anything besides my own pulse pounding through my ears. When I reached the crest of the small hill, I expected to find a body. I didn't. I found the tree. Split. Not fallen. Split. Down the middle, like something enormous had gripped it and torn it open from trunk to roots. Sap bled from both halves, bright and sticky, glistening like amber under my light. At the base of the split trunk was another piece of the uniform, and next to it, a boot, still laced, still containing a foot. I swallowed hard. My throat felt raw. I shouldn't have stepped closer, but I did. The forest felt like it was holding its breath again, waiting for me to take the next step. The air grew colder the closer I got to the tree, a sudden temperature drop that felt unnatural, like stepping into a cave carved from winter. I touched the trunk. Warm. The tree was warm, not heated by the sun. Warm, like something had held it, gripped it, something alive. I stumbled back. Panic edged up my spine in a cold, pulsing wave. I scanned the ground for prints, and there they were. The same long, narrow, too-deep footprints I'd seen in the other clearing. The spacing was massive. Whatever made them had a stride too wide for any person, and the toe marks bit deep into the soil. Following them was the worst mistake I could have made. But my training kicked in. If there was any chance at all that the ranger was still alive, I had to follow, even though some part of me whispered he was already beyond saving. The prints led downhill into a denser part of the forest where the trees grew close and the light dimmed to a permanent dusk. My breath clouded slightly even though it was late spring. The ground grew soft beneath my boots, muffling every step. And then it hit me. The forest was listening, not watching. Listening. The silence carried tension, as if the woods themselves were waiting for the next sound, waiting for me to betray my position. I slowed my breathing as much as possible, but the crunch of pine needles sounded deafening. Another step, another footfall. Ahead of me. Louder now, heavier, too slow to be a running animal, too purposeful to be random. Branches swayed slightly in a ripple, like something enormous had brushed past them. I crouched behind a fallen log, waited, counted the footsteps. 1, pause. 2, pause. 3, then nothing. The forest stilled. I held my breath. A shadow moved between the trees, massive, sloping, broad-shouldered in a way no man could be. The silhouette shifted slightly, and I saw just a sliver of it through the trunks, matted pale fur, long arms. It was a head that tilted slightly as if sniffing the air. Its breath fogged in thick plumes even from 30 yards away. I didn't move. Couldn't move. The creature took 3 steps, each one sinking several inches into the soil. Then it stopped, turned its head. The angle of its posture told me one thing. It knew I was there. It had known for a while, and it had led me here on purpose. That I wasn't dealing with just an animal. Animals flee or defend. Predators stalk or ambush. But this thing waited. It led. It chose its ground. It controlled the silence like it owned the forest, like the trees themselves deferred to it. My breath trembled as I pressed myself lower against the log. Even the wood felt tense beneath my gloves, vibrating faintly with the rhythm of my heartbeat. The air thickened. That sweetness, God, that sickly sweetness, coiled around me like fog, sinking into my clothes, into my lungs, into something deeper than breath. The creature shifted again, and a beam of thin daylight slipping through the canopy struck its fur. It was pale, not white, not gray, something in between, like the underside of fur bark peeled too early. Long strands, matted in places, hung from its arms. Its shoulders were hunched from either age or burden or anatomy I didn't understand. Its head was large, sloped, with a ridge across the brow that cast its eyes into shadow. But even from that distance, I felt them on me. Heavy, evaluating, calculating. I gripped the radio on my chest, but my fingers didn't move. I knew if I made even the smallest sound, it would be over. Every instinct screamed to stay still, to wait, to become another log, another shape in the forest, to hope it lost interest, but it didn't. Slowly, with an eerie, deliberate grace, it lowered itself toward the ground. Not on hands and knees, no. It folded at the joints in a strange, fluid motion, almost like melting downward. Large hands, too large, too long, pressed into the soil. Its fingers spread wide, digging into the forest floor. Not claws, not exactly. Just wrong. Too human in shape, too inhuman in proportion. The creature pressed its head close to the ground as if listening. To what? To me. My heartbeat hammered hard enough I thought the creature could hear it through the earth. It inhaled then, slow, deep, rattling, and the sound raised every hair along my arms. It smelled the air like a dog, but the motion was gentler, intentional, a hunter savoring the last steps before confirming its kill. My vision tunneled. Every nerve in my body screamed, move, but something deeper locked me in place. Not fear, something colder. Recognition. The forest had shown me glimpses of its secrets for years, but this was the heart of them. This was what the locals whispered about. The pale walkers, the ridge spirits, the old things, the ones no one described the same way twice because no one ever got close enough to know if memory or terror shaped the details. And now I was closer to it than any ranger before me. The creature rose slightly, its head turning in a slow arc until it faced me directly, though it shouldn't have been able to see me through the trees and branches. But it did. It saw me. Even obscured by shadow, I could feel the weight of its stare, the intelligence behind it, the malice, or maybe the curiosity woven through every slow breath it took. Then, without warning, it stood to its full height. It towered. Not by inches, by feet. I heard my own heartbeat in my ears, thudding in desperate, painful bursts. The creature stepped forward, each movement sending vibrations rippling through the ground. It didn't rush. It didn't leap. It didn't threaten. It approached like something that didn't need threats, like something that had already won. I pressed tighter against the log, ready to bolt, ready to run for my life. But something in me broke, not into panic, but clarity. A memory surfaced, clear and sharp as an icicle. The first ranger missing in these woods over 40 years ago. His journal found years later half frozen in a drainage ditch with the final written line, "They want you to run." My skin went cold, so I didn't move. The creature stepped closer, tilting its head, nostrils flaring slightly as it inhaled again. Its breath fogged the air in wide plumes. It was close now, 20 yards, then 15. My muscles burned from resisting instinct. 10 yards. The sweetness was suffocating. 5. I could hear it breathing. 3. I saw its eyes, yellow-white, clouded like old glass, reflective, ancient. It leaned down. The forest held its breath with me. I swear the entire ridge tilted in expectation. And then a crack echoed through the trees. Not from the creature, from behind it, a branch snapping. The creature jerked upright so fast the air distorted around its movement. It pivoted, posture shifting from calculated curiosity to raw, violent alertness. Another crack, this one closer. The creature stepped backwards, scanning the trees, and for the first time I saw something I never expected. Fear. Not directed at me, at something else, something deeper in the forest. The creature let out a sound I still can't describe, a low guttural rumble that vibrated the air between us. A warning, a signal, a call. It stepped back again. Then it melted into the tree line with impossible speed, but its pale form swallowed by the darkness of the pines. The moment it vanished, sound rushed back into the world, birds calling frantically, wind ripping through the branches, the forest exhaling all at once. My knees buckled and I braced myself against the log, sucking in ragged breaths. But one sound cut through everything. A faint, rhythmic knocking in the distance. Not from the creature, from deeper, from whatever it had feared. I radioed for backup again. The connection was weak but functional. They reached me in 20 minutes, but by then the creature was gone, the footprints scattered, the smell fading. They found the severed hand, the boot, pieces of uniform, but no body, no sign of struggle beyond what I already saw. We searched until nightfall, then the next day, then the next. We never found him. Search teams insisted he either fell, was dragged by an animal, or got disoriented. They said the hand must have been separated by scavengers, but the cuts were clean, too clean, and I didn't tell them about the creature or about the thing it feared. Some truths don't survive retelling, not without twisting, not without growing teeth. Over the next year, incidents multiplied, people vanishing, strange smells reported along the trails, knocking sounds heard late at night by hunters, shadows moving in ways shadows shouldn't, the forest watching through a new set of eyes. The older rangers started leaving early. The locals warned hikers to stay out of the pines after dusk, and I stopped pretending I didn't feel the presence tracking me. Every patrol felt like a test. Every sound carried weight. Every shift in temperature was a message. I didn't know if the creature saw me as a threat or a curiosity or a mistake it intended to correct. But I knew one thing for certain. Something else lived deeper in those woods, something the creature feared enough to flee, something that knocked from within the earth, something that listened more than it watched, something that wasn't done with me yet. It didn't take long before the forest began acting differently, as if something deep beneath the soil had awakened after years of restless sleep. At first it was subtle, just a shift in the way the wind moved, or how sounds carried farther than they should. But then the signs became impossible to ignore. The pines creaked at night, even on windless evenings, their tall spines groaning like they were bearing a heavy burden. The rivers ran colder, the fog lingered longer, and the sweet smell, that sickening, clinging sweetness, began showing up in places where no incident had ever occurred. It felt like the forest was warning me, or preparing me, and then one night the knocking returned, not in the distance, not behind me, but under my cabin. It started with a faint vibration, a soft tremor in the floorboards. I'd felt earthquakes before, mild ones that shuddered along the old timber foundations. This wasn't that. This was slower, rhythmic. It rose through the boards in 3 gentle taps. Silence. 3 more. A pause. A breath-like hush between each set. Tap, tap, tap. Tap, tap, tap. I froze at my table, pen hovering over a report I'd been pretending to write. My boots felt the vibrations first, then my legs. My entire body recognized the pattern instantly, even if my mind fought it. Something was moving beneath the cabin. Not scuttling, not burrowing, knocking, as if it knew exactly where I was sitting. I stood slowly, scanning the room. My flashlight sat on the shelf by the window, my radio on the hook near the door. The air felt thick, like breathing through wet cloth. My heart hammered against my ribs so hard it felt bruising. Another knock came. This one directly under my feet. I staggered back instinctively, slamming my hip into the counter. My mug toppled and rolled, hitting the floor with a hollow thud that felt louder than any scream. Everything stilled. The knocking stopped. Silence swallowed the room whole. Then from beneath the cabin a sigh drifted upward, a long, low exhale that vibrated through the beams. My skin crawled as the breath drifted up through the gaps in the floorboards and brushed the bottom of my boots. Warm. Too warm. Instinct said run. But another instinct, the one rangers earn through years of walking into things most people run from, said wait. It was the waiting that saved me. Because if I had bolted for the door, I wouldn't have heard it. The voice. Not a word. Not a sentence. Just a sound shaped almost like human breath struggling to form language. It rasped upward, dry and broken, as though something unused to speaking was trying to mimic the shape of speech. A strained whisper. Not outside, not under the cabin. Inside the walls. I backed toward the doorway, keeping my breathing shallow, keeping every step slow enough not to creak. My hand reached for the radio without conscious thought, but I didn't call anyone. What would I say? That something was whispering inside the cabin structure? That the floor had breathed beneath my boots? I reached for the door handle. A knock hit the wood inches from my hand. Not tapping this time. Slamming. 3 violent blows that rattled the hinges. Dust burst from the frame. The entire cabin shook. My breath seized in my chest. Another slam. Then another. Whatever was on the other side wasn't trying to get in. It was trying to stop me from leaving. I stumbled backward as the door shuttered again. I grabbed the flashlight and swung it around the room, pointing it at the windows, the corners, the dark seams where the logs met. The sweetness seeped into the air slowly, drifting out from some invisible source like fog rolling from beneath the foundation. And under it all, soft, almost tender, the whispering continued. I pressed myself against the far wall. My pulse thudded so violently that I felt it in my teeth. Then everything went quiet. The forest outside stilled. The knocking stopped. The whispering faded like a breath dissolving into cold air. The sweetness thinned. And then a sharp crack split open the night. Not from the door, not from the walls, but from deep within the woods behind the cabin. The same sound I'd heard in the clearing the day I saw the creature flee. The sound of something huge moving through the trees. The forest groaned. Branches split. A tremor rippled through the ground. The cabin shuddered on its stilts. But this time, I knew what was coming. Not the pale creature. The thing that creature feared. I grabbed my jacket, my pack, my emergency flare, and shoved open the back door, sprinting into the night. Cold air slapped my face. The moon was barely visible through a web of clouds, but the dim light was enough to show me movement on the ridge. Massive, deliberate, heavy enough to shake the soil. I stopped at the tree line and listened. A low hum echoed through the woods. Deep, resonant, not natural, not animal. It pulsed across the forest floor like a heartbeat amplified through the roots. The pale creature's warning. I looked toward the ridge. A shape moved between the trees. Huge, slow. Not walking, emerging. The silhouette was broader than any living creature should be, its outline shifting subtly as if its form wasn't fixed. Branches bent aside without breaking, as if the thing wasn't pushing through the forest but passing through it. My breath fogged violently, each exhale sharp as glass. Frost crept along the ferns at my feet, despite the mild night. The air around me dropped 10, 20 degrees in seconds. The thing moved again, and for the first time I heard it speak. Not in words, in rhythm. A deep, hollow knock that echoed through the valley. 1, then 2, then 3. The same pattern, the same cadence, the same knocking that had followed me from the clearing 8 years ago. I realized then the knocking had never been the creature. It had been this, the thing beneath the forest, the thing that lived deeper than roots, the thing the pale creature feared enough to flee from. I stumbled backward, adrenaline firing hard enough to drown out every thought. I wanted to run. God, I wanted to run. But before I could take another step, a wave of cold swept over me like a shadow passing through my bones. And then I understood something simple and terrifying. It wasn't approaching the cabin. It wasn't approaching the valley. It was approaching me. The forest bent with it, bowing almost imperceptibly as if the pines themselves were leaning away. My breath came in short, ragged pulls. The world dimmed around the edges. And then a roar. Not from the knocking entity. From behind me, a bellow so loud the trees shook, so powerful it punched the air from my lungs. The pale creature. It had returned, not to hunt me, to block the other thing's path. The roar echoed off the ridge. The forest cracked. The knocking answered with one long, resonant blow that made the ground tremble. Then, silence, a standstill, an ancient stalemate. I don't remember running. I don't remember reaching the ranger station. All I remember is stumbling through the doors covered in frost, lungs burning, vision spinning as the younger rangers swarmed me and asked what happened. I told them I slipped on ice. I told them the cold night caught me off guard. I told them nothing else. Some truths die the moment you speak them. Some survive. The forest keeps the rest. And the sweetest lies are the ones the pines whisper when you stand alone at dusk, pretending the strange shapes between the trees are just shadows. I've been a ranger for 23 years. Sometimes I still smell sweetness on the wind. Sometimes the knocks return. Sometimes I wake to frost on my cabin floor in the middle of summer. But the one thing I've never forgotten is this: fear doesn't always live in the dark. Sometimes it lives in the soil, sometimes it lives in the trees, sometimes it lives in you. And sometimes it knocks. The first time I truly understood what it meant to feel watched by a forest, I wasn't staring into a pair of glowing eyes or hearing footsteps behind me. I was simply standing alone in the pre-dawn stillness, coffee cooling in my hand, when the pines around me seemed to lean just slightly closer, like they were inhaling, like they were waking up with me. And in that moment, something inside me said quietly, "This place remembers you." My name isn't important. Not anymore. Not when the stories themselves have taken on a life larger than any ranger's badge. I'm 39, with more years on the trail than I care to count, and I've spent most of my adult life patrolling a stretch of remote woodland that locals still call the Whisper Pines, even though no map uses that name now. To outsiders, it's just another northern forest, thick with lodgepole pine, cold creeks sliding over granite, air sharp with the clean bite of sap. But to the people who grew up here, the ones whose grandparents lived on the outskirts before the roads came through, these woods carry a reputation earned long before I ever set foot in them. They say the mountains keep their dead close. They say the pines guard what the wind cannot carry away. They say if you walk the forest alone long enough, something that isn't quite animal and isn't quite human will walk with you. I didn't believe any of that when I first arrived. I grew up hiking, camping, running through forests bigger than small towns, convinced the wilderness was predictable if you kept your head clear. But Whisper Pines changed that slowly, like water wearing down stone, one patient drop at a time. At first, it was just an unease, a quiet impression that the trails shifted more than they should, that echoes carried a little too far, that even the wildlife moved differently when the sun dipped below the tree line. But I rationalized everything. A ranger can't afford to be superstitious. You start imagining things, you start hesitating, and hesitation can get you killed out here. My first fall season in the Whisper Pines was colder than expected. The kind of cold that isn't just weather, but presence. Like the temperature drops because something big is passing through unseen. Local hunters kept their camps small and their fires bright, and they packed up early whenever the wind shifted suddenly. I laughed it off then, chalking it up to mountain folklore. But the forest has its own curriculum, and it teaches whether you want to learn or not. My initiation came in the form of a disappearance, my first major call as a newly assigned ranger. A man named Carson had been hiking alone near Timberline Ridge, a trail notorious for sudden fog banks and steep drop-offs. The call came in just before dusk. He hadn't checked in with his wife, and his GPS tracker had stopped transmitting. I grabbed my pack, radio, and headlamp and headed up the ridge. Standard procedure. Nothing supernatural, nothing strange, just a lost hiker. The fog met me halfway. It wasn't the usual drifting mist that softens the trail. This fog rose unnaturally fast, dense enough that the beam of my headlamp looked like a solid white rod in the air. Every breath felt damp and cold. I followed the trail slowly, speaking Carson's name, listening for any reply. But the forest swallowed my voice whole, and then came the knocking. It started softly, 2 taps against wood. I whipped my head toward the sound, expecting to see a woodpecker. Nothing. I moved a few steps forward, 2 more taps, then silence. I told myself it was just a branch shifting under frost. But the rhythm was too deliberate, too even, and it was following me. Each time I moved, the knocking responded, closer, the same double tap, like a signal meant only for me. Doubt creeps into the mind differently in a fog-shrouded forest. It slides under your ribs, it speaks in your own voice, it reminds you of every story you've heard but never believed. I pressed forward, pretending the knocking meant nothing. Rangers are trained to ignore their nerves, but not their instincts, and my instincts were telling me someone, or something, was pacing me from the tree line. When I finally found Carson, he wasn't injured or trapped. He was standing perfectly still near the edge of the ridge, staring into the fog as though he were watching something moving in it. I approached slowly, calling his name again, and he turned toward me with a look that didn't match the situation. Not fear, not relief, just emptiness, like his emotions hadn't caught up with his body yet. I asked what happened. He said he didn't know. He'd heard someone calling his name from off-trail. A voice he recognized, his brother's, who died the previous winter. He knew it couldn't be real. He knew it. But he said the voice was so clear, so familiar, and then everything went white. He didn't remember walking off the trail, didn't remember the fog rolling in, didn't remember how long he'd stood there. When I tried to guide him back, he stumbled like he'd forgotten how to move downhill. The entire way down, the knocking followed us. Tap, tap, pause. Tap, tap. Always just behind the next tree. I didn't mention it to Carson. His mind was fragile enough already, but he kept glancing over his shoulder like he heard something too. When we reached the truck and the fog finally thinned, the knocking stopped as abruptly as it had begun. Later, once Carson was safe and his wife had taken him home, I stayed late at the station reviewing my incident notes. I wrote tree branch next to the knocking. I wrote disorientation due to weather next to Carson's behavior. I wrote sound illusions common in dense fog and underlined it twice. But the pen scratched harder with each rationalization, like the paper resisted my attempts to make sense of something that refused to fit inside the boundaries of logic. That night, I lay awake in my cabin, replaying the sound in my head. The rhythmic tap-tap echoed beneath my thoughts, and I couldn't sleep. Hours passed. I told myself it was just an overactive mind. Then, just past 2 a.m, someone or something knocked twice on my front door. Slow. Deliberate, identical rhythm. Tap, tap. I didn't open the door. I didn't breathe. I just lay there staring at the ceiling, knowing the forest had followed me home. And for the first time since becoming a ranger, I felt something I couldn't deny. The Whisper Pines were studying me just as closely as I was studying them. I didn't open the door. I didn't move until the first hint of dawn brushed against the edges of the blinds. Only then did I step onto the porch after letting the cold morning air fill my lungs, grounding me. Nothing waited outside, no footprints in the dirt, no broken pine needles, no sign that anything had approached the cabin at all. But the wood of the door still seemed to hold the echo of the knocks, like the vibration had sunk into the grain. For the next week, I threw myself into work. Anything to stop thinking about the sound. Anything to convince myself that it was a coincidence, a trick of exhaustion, a branch smacking the siding at the exact wrong time. But that kind of denial is thin. Light shows through it if you hold it up too long. And Whisper Pines, it has a way of finding those cracks. The second incident happened 3 days later, early morning, when frost still clung to the grass. I was responding to a report of strange tracks near an abandoned service road that cut through an old-growth stand of pines. The road used to lead to a fire lookout decades ago, long since collapsed. Locals avoided the area without admitting why. They'd change the subject, say the trail washed out, say it wasn't worth the time. I could hear the fear in the omissions. The tracks were unusual, larger than any bear in the region, spaced too far apart for a moose, and shaped wrong, almost like human footprints, but stretched. The stride was enormous, consistent, purposeful. Each print pressed several inches into the frozen mud, which meant the creature was heavy, too heavy. I crouched beside the first clear print, running my fingers along the edge. Warm, slightly, as if whatever made it wasn't long gone. Something shifted in the tree line. Not a branch, not wind, something stepping back. I straightened slowly, scanning the dark green corridor between the trunks. The air in Whisper Pines carries sound differently. The forest doesn't echo so much as swallow and return it softened. But this was crisp, sharp, close. I called out, identifying myself, trying to sound official. No answer. Not even the usual scatter of small animals spooked by a human voice. It felt as though the forest held its breath. I followed the tracks deeper until they veered abruptly off-road and into thick brush. The branches looked pushed aside, not broken. Whatever moved through here had intelligence or instinct enough to pass without disturbing much. I noted the direction on my map but didn't follow further. Ranger protocol is clear when prints suggest something beyond a typical wildlife encounter. I radioed the information in, spoke calmly, professionally, but my pulse hammered so hard I could feel it in my throat. As I began the hike back, the forest grew colder. Not gradually. One step warm, the next step carrying a chill so sudden I stopped walking. Mist slid between the trees, low to the ground like it was rolling downhill. The light dimmed, though the sky was clear. I felt watched again, but not from one direction. It came from all sides, a pressure that tightened around my ribs. Then I smelled it, an odor thick and strangely sweet, like decaying pine needles or wet fur that hadn't dried. The scent clung to the air in a way that made my stomach turn and my instincts snap awake. I'd smelled predators before. Mountain lions, wolves, bears. But this scent wasn't like any of them. It was wrong. Heavy. Ancient. I gripped my radio tighter. Static crackled faintly, a whisper of interference like someone was trying to speak through water. I tapped the receiver, adjusting the dial, but the static followed me, growing louder. Beneath it, I thought I heard something else. A faint exhale. Long, slow, close. Every nerve told me to run. But rangers don't run without a reason, and fear alone doesn't count. So I kept walking, forcing my steps to stay even. Measured. Human. Whatever followed, I didn't want it thinking I was prey. When I reached the service road again, the temperature shifted back to normal so fast it felt like stepping across an invisible line. The scent dissipated too, leaving only the crisp smell of frost. I told no one about the exhale. Not yet. I needed more than instinct. I needed proof. But that silence didn't protect me. It only made the next encounter worse. A few nights later, a call came from one of our old fire crew members, a man named O'Malley, who lived in a cabin deeper in the pines than anyone else still working in the district. He had decades of service behind him, 40 years of wildfire seasons, trail searches, emergency evacuations, Nights spent sleeping under trees so tall the stars were cut into thin pieces. He was tough, experienced, hard to rattle. I'd never heard fear in his voice until that night. He told dispatch something was circling his cabin, something big, something he could hear breathing. When I arrived, his cabin was dark except for a single lantern on the porch. The air smelled like cold sap and something else, something familiar. That same sweet, decaying scent I'd caught near the tracks. It hit the back of my throat like rot, but softer, almost floral. A scent pretending to be harmless. O'Malley was inside, shotgun in hand, face pale. He pointed toward the tree line, toward a patch of darkness that felt wrong somehow. Too still, too dense, like the forest was holding something inside it. "It's been circling," he whispered, "for an hour. You hear it?" I held my breath. Yes, I heard it, a slow drag of breath. Wet, deep, lower to the ground than any person but higher than most animals. A skulking rhythm, one that moved with intention. O'Malley raised the shotgun, but I placed a hand on it, pushing it gently downward. "We need to see it clearly first," I whispered. But clarity wasn't something the whisper pines offered. A branch snapped. Not a small one, something thick, the kind of sound made by something with mass. I turned my flashlight toward the trees. The beam cut through the dark, catching the glint of frost, the pale stripe of exposed bark, and then something moved, if I could describe, not fully. A suggestion of a figure too tall to be human, too broad in the shoulders, covered in something that absorbed the light rather than reflected it. I didn't see eyes, I didn't see a face, but I felt its attention hit me like a weight. The breathing grew louder, then stopped. Silence filled the clearing, heavy, expectant. Slowly, the shape shifted backward into the darkness, vanishing without a sound. Not a rustle, not a footfall, nothing. It was gone, but the scent lingered. O'Malley lowered the shotgun with shaking hands. "You tell the district?" he asked, voice raw. It wasn't a question. It was a plea. He wanted someone else to carry the truth he'd been forced to see. I should have. Protocol said I should have reported the encounter immediately. But fear isn't always loud. Sometimes it whispers with perfect logic. Sometimes it uses your own voice. And that night it said, "You don't have enough. You need more before you tell anyone. You need proof, or they'll think you're losing it out here." So I lied. I told him it was probably a bear with mange, moving strangely because of an injury. He didn't argue. But he didn't believe me either. As I drove back to my cabin, the scent faded from my clothes, leaving my skin prickling with cold. The knocking from that first night echoed faintly in my mind, and for the first time, I felt the thin line between ranger and prey bend beneath my feet. I didn't know then that the worst encounter, the one locals still whisper about, would come from deep within the forest's oldest territory, a place where maps go blank, a place where the pines grow too close together, their trunks forming walls that block out sound, light, and reason. A place where something waited beneath the earth, listening. A cave the old families refused to speak of. A cave I should never have entered. I should have turned back the moment I saw the cave mouth. Even before I stepped inside, it felt like the forest itself recoiled from it. The pines around the clearing bent ever so slightly away, branches curling subtly like they were trying to avoid brushing against the stone. Even the birds refused to land in the nearby canopy. The air changed too. Heavier, older. The kind of cold that sinks into the teeth before you even open your mouth. But reason felt fragile by then, stretched thin by weeks of strange tracks, echoing breaths, and that scent I couldn't shake from memory. I told myself exploring the cave was smart, logical. If something was living out here, something powerful enough to make prints that deep, something that circled cabins and waited for rangers to step just close enough, then the cave might hold answers. In truth, I think the forest nudged me toward it. Or maybe it was whatever lived beneath the pines, calling me deeper the way it had called Carson off the trail. The opening was taller than a human, almost oval, with a jagged rim of rock that curved inward like a mouth frozen mid-scream. Moss grew in thick mats along the outside, but stopped abruptly at the threshold. Not a single vine crossed into the darkness. Even plants understood what I refused to. I clicked on my headlamp, the beam slicing forward into thick black. The cave swallowed the light faster than it should have, like the stone wanted to drink it. I stepped inside. The temperature dropped instantly. My breath fogged out in pale bursts. Beneath the usual cave cold was a deeper chill, something unnatural, like walking through the shadow of a storm that hadn't arrived yet. The sound of dripping water echoed rhythmically somewhere far in the dark, but the rhythm shifted when I moved, sometimes aligning with my steps, sometimes against them. It felt like the cave was listening. A narrow passage stretched forward, the walls curving inward as though the stone had been shaped by something that didn't use hands. My footfalls echoed too sharply. The acoustics were wrong. Echoes came before the sound, not after. After 20 feet, the scent hit, faint at first, then unmistakable. That sweet decaying pine needle smell, heavy, floral at the edges, like a perfume made from rot. The same scent that had hovered outside O'Malley's cabin. The same scent that had lingered after the tall shape vanished into the trees. The same scent the wind carried toward me near the tracks. I was close to whatever made it. A rustle drifted from deeper inside, slow, measured, not the frantic scuttle of small animals, something large, something dragging one limb slightly behind the other. My heart thudded so hard my ribs ached, yet I moved forward, not because I was brave. Fear had carved too deeply for bravery. I moved because something inside the cave pulled at me, subtle but insistent, like a thread tied to my sternum being drawn gently inward. The passage widened suddenly into a chamber. My headlamp cut across stone walls etched with what looked like claw marks. Long gouges, parallel, fresh. The floor sloped downward. At the lowest point, a pool of still, dark water reflected my light in a quivering halo. But the reflection it gave back wasn't entirely mine. I froze. Standing beside my reflected silhouette was another shape. Taller, bulkier. Its outline blurred, too indistinct to define, but its head was wrong. Elongated, sloping back. Shoulders hunched, arms long enough to reach its knees. It looked like a distorted human carved from night. I whipped around. Nothing. Only the still chamber, the quiet drip of water, and my own breath trembling out of me. I turned back to the reflection. The thing stood closer now, not in the cave. In the reflection. Its head tilted slowly, as if studying me. My throat tightened till breathing felt like swallowing broken glass. I stepped back from the water. The reflection stepped forward. The cave air thickened. A pressure built against my temples like sound waves too low to hear but strong enough to feel. My legs braced instinctively as if waiting for an impact. Then a voice, no, not a voice, a vibration rose from the stone itself. A low, resonant hum vibrating through the chamber walls. It wasn't language, yet it communicated something terrible and familiar. Recognition. It knew me. My radio crackled violently, a burst of static so loud it echoed inside my skull. I flinched, clutching the device. Beneath the static, a faint, wet breathing pushed through the speaker, synced exactly with the exhale I'd heard outside O'Malley's cabin. I turned off the radio, but the breathing continued, no longer from the radio. From the chamber, behind me. I didn't turn. I couldn't. Every instinct screamed that if I looked, I would not walk out of this cave. Whatever stood behind me was waiting for that moment, waiting for acknowledgement. Instead, I took one slow step forward, then another. My boots slid slightly on damp stone. The breathing grew louder, closer, as though leaning toward the back of my neck. The scent flooded the chamber, sweet, rotting, suffocating. It filled my lungs until my throat burned. Tears blurred my vision. I moved faster, my steps uneven but determined. The hum in the walls intensified. The chamber vibrated lightly, dust falling from the ceiling like ash. Something shifted behind me. A footfall. Then another. Heavy. Deliberate. I didn't run. Not yet. Running in a cave meant broken bones, wrong turns, darkness swallowing you whole. I walked with the steady pace of someone who knew the trail home. It was the only thing that kept whatever followed from lunging. When I reached the narrow passage, the walls closed in around me again, the tight space offering a strange sense of protection. The breathing faded slightly, but not enough. It still echoed faintly, as though blocked by the narrowing rock. Only when I saw a sliver of daylight ahead did my restraints snap. I ran. Stones scraped my shoulders as I threw myself down the passage, boots slamming against the ground. The scent followed, chasing me like a wave of rot. The breathing surged behind me, closer now, too close. I burst out of the cave into blinding daylight, tripping over a root and crashing into the dirt. My palms tore open on sharp gravel. I scrambled backward until my spine hit a pine trunk. The clearing was silent. The cave mouth loomed ahead, dark and patient. Nothing stepped out. Nothing followed. But the treetops shook, violently, as if something huge had moved through them just moments earlier. Pine cones rained down. Branches bent under invisible weight, and a low, distant growl rolled across the canopy, not from the cave, but from somewhere deeper in the woods, as though the forest was speaking on behalf of whatever I'd encountered. I didn't stay. I didn't investigate. I ran back to the main trail and didn't slow until the ranger station came into view. I told no one the truth. I filed the incident as a cave safety inspection due to erosion risk, advising closure until further notice. I didn't describe the reflection, the hum, the creature. I didn't mention the breathing. I didn't tell them that something inside the mountain recognized me, as if it had been waiting. But the forest wasn't through with me. Something changed after the cave. The pines looked different, leaned closer when I passed. Shadows stretched slightly longer. The air carried that faint, rotting sweetness more often. Some nights I woke to tapping on the cabin walls, soft, probing, curious. And on one of those nights, as I lay frozen in bed, I realized the knocking wasn't coming from the outside. It came from under the floorboards, from the crawl space beneath the cabin, from something that had followed me all the way out of the cave, something learning me. The first time I heard the knocking beneath the floorboards, I thought it was a raccoon, or maybe I wanted it to be. The sound was soft at first, 3 delicate taps, like fingertips brushing wood, not claws, not paws, fingers. The noise came exactly from beneath the bed frame, as though something lay flat in the darkness under me, waiting. I held still, breathing quietly through my nose, listening. The forest outside was calm, owls calling distantly, wind whispering through pine needles. Everything normal, everything ordinary. But the knocking below me came again. Slow, deliberate, spaced just far enough apart that it felt intelligent. I swung my legs off the bed, lowering my feet silently to the floor. The knocking stopped, not faded, not drifted away. It froze completely, like whatever made the sound was listening for my next move. My skin crawled. The air inside the cabin thickened with the scent I'd come to dread. Sweet rot, old pine, a moist earthiness that didn't belong inside walls. It drifted up from the floorboards in faint wisps, seeping through the wood. I crouched slowly, my breath shaking, pressing an ear to the cold planks. Silence, but it wasn't empty silence. It felt crowded, as if someone else was holding their breath too, inches beneath me. My voice trembled as I whispered, "Who's down there?" For a moment, nothing. Then, softly, so faint I thought I imagined it, a quiet, wet exhale drifted up from the crawlspace. My heart slammed against my ribs. I backed away from the bed like someone retreating from a sleeping predator. But the scent followed, growing stronger, blooming into the cabin like a flower opening. I moved toward the door, grabbing my jacket, my radio, my boots, anything to anchor me. Before I reached the handle, the knocking resumed, faster now, like hurried communication. Tap, 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 tap. Urgent, insistent. Then something scraped across the underside of the floor. Long, dragging lines that matched the gouges inside the cave. A shudder ran through the wooden frame of the cabin. That was the moment I realized the truth I'd been avoiding. Whatever lived in the cave, whatever had watched me from reflections, whatever circled O'Malley's cabin, it wasn't bound to the depths of the forest. It could follow. It had followed, farther than I'd ever thought possible. I flung open the door and stepped into the freezing night air. The forest felt vast and watchful around me, each pine a tall, silent witness. I shined my flashlight under the cabin, sweeping the narrow crawl space. Dust floated through the beam. Cobwebs hung undisturbed, nothing moved, nothing crouched, nothing breathed, but the scent lingered, heavy as fog. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on the porch steps until the first gray hints of dawn reached over the mountains. As light crept into the forest, the heaviness receded, and the scent thinned until it was gone. The world returned to normal, or pretended to. Over the next few days, small things kept shifting. The woods felt restless. Tracks appeared near patrol routes, long, sprawling strides too large for any known animal. Sometimes I'd hear distant knocks echoing between the pines, traveling tree to tree like a code only the forest understood. One evening, while checking a trail closure sign near Timberline Ridge, I found something hanging from a branch, a strip of moss twisted into a shape eerily similar to the cave's entrance, an oval jagged at the edges. It swung gently despite the still air. Another time, on a quiet patrol near dusk, I came across O'Malley standing motionless on the trail. He stared into the trees, shotgun hanging uselessly in his hands. When I called out, he didn't react at first. Only when I touched his shoulder did he blink, eyes clearing as though waking from a dream. "It followed me," he whispered. "All the way from the house. I saw it between the trees, tall as a damn telephone pole." That was the last shift O'Malley ever worked. He turned in his gear 2 days later and moved out of state with the kind of haste that doesn't leave time for goodbyes. As fall deepened, the nights grew colder. Long stretches of fog wound through the understory like pale serpents. The forest felt coordinated, like one interconnected organism watching me from every angle. I couldn't walk 10 minutes without feeling pressure around me, unseen eyes pushing against my awareness. But the event that broke me didn't happen on patrol. It happened during what should have been an ordinary welfare check. A pair of tourists had reported hearing strange howling near a backcountry campsite, sounds too deep and too close to human. I hiked the 2 hours to their site and found their fire still burning, but their tent slashed open, their gear scattered in a strange circle around the ashes. Their footprints ran in 2 parallel lines leading downhill, as if they'd fled blindly. And following those prints were others. Heavy, long-striding, human-shaped but distorted. The same tracks from the service road. I followed cautiously. 50 yards down the trail, the tourists' footprints stopped, not turned around. Not veered off, stopped, as if they'd been lifted straight into the trees. The smell of rot surrounded the area, strong enough to sting my eyes. The forest was silent, unnaturally so. Even the wind held still. Then something cracked behind me. I spun, flashlight cutting across the dark. Between 2 pines stood a figure, tall, unmoving, silhouette blurred at the edges like heat rising from asphalt. Shoulders hunched, head angled downward, arms almost too long. I could not see its face, but I felt it looking at me. The air vibrated, the same low hum I'd heard in the cave now rising through the pines like breath through a giant throat. My knees nearly buckled. I stepped backward carefully, 1 foot behind the other. The figure leaned slightly forward. That movement broke me. I turned and ran. Branches tore at my jacket. Rocks skidded under my boots. The forest twisted strangely. Paths curved where they shouldn't. Familiar trees appeared in the wrong places, the world bending as though trying to mislead me. The hum followed. So did the scent. So did the breathing. Deep, rhythmic, synchronizing with my own panic-shattered heartbeat. Only when I saw the glow of my cabin's porch light did the forest release me. The hum faded. The air warmed. The presence behind me retreated like a wave rolling back into black sea. I stumbled inside and slammed the door shut. My hands shook so violently I had to lock it twice. The tapping came moments later, faint, exploratory taps around the doorframe along the window edges at the corner of the house. Testing. Learning. Then silence. I sank onto the floor, chest heaving, stomach knotted with the cold truth I could no longer deny. This wasn't a single creature. It wasn't an anomaly. It was the forest's memory made flesh. The Yeti stories, the whispered tales, the old warnings the locals refused to speak openly. They weren't exaggerations. They weren't superstition. They were survival strategies. Whisper Pines was old in a way that made human time feel insignificant. Something lived beneath its roots and caves, something that didn't see us as predators or prey, but as wanderers entering a territory that obeyed different laws of existence. And it chose who it showed itself to: Carson, O'Malley, the missing tourists, and now me. Months have passed since then. I still work the district, though my patrols are shorter, my routes chosen with instinct rather than training. I feel the forest differently now, not as land to protect, but as an immense presence watching from all sides. The pines seem to shift subtly when I walk beneath them. The cave stays sealed behind a landslide I didn't report clearing. And some nights, when the wind pauses and the world holds breath, I still hear soft knocking beneath the floorboards. But I stay. Not because I'm unafraid, because the forest remembers me, and I remember it. And out here, in the place locals still whisper about, memory is the only bond that keeps you alive. In the end, I've learned this much. The wilderness doesn't want your fear. It wants your respect. Because everything that breathes among the pines, seen or unseen, has a story older than ours. And some stories don't stop when you walk away. Some follow